Like it's perfect. All right. So again, good morning. This is the Decoding Dyslexia Strategies that Support Every Learning presentation, every learner. As I mentioned, the sign-in sheet or the sign-in link is in the chat. You can go ahead and go all the way up. It should be pinned. And you can also get a copy of the slide deck on the link or the chat as well. If you have any questions, you can always feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or use the chat, whatever you are more comfortable with. So really quick, I like to go over norms and objectives. I want to make sure you know what you're going to be getting into today and what I'm going to be talking about so that you're fully aware of everything. Norms, start and end on time. Please take care of yourself. If you need to get up, grab some food, do what you got to do. This is ultimately for you. And then listen and speak with empathy, respectful communication. Use the chat to ask questions, but like I mentioned, you can also go ahead and raise your hand or unmute yourself. And then if you are not speaking, please mute yourself. I have had situations where people are talking and there's so much noise going on. And sometimes we can't find who is talking because of the amount of people in the chat or in the group. Does anybody have any questions about the norms, or is there anything you'd like to add? All right, and our objectives. So today I want to help you all with strategies to design inclusive lessons and integrate support tools that address the need of emerging bilinguals, students with disabilities, and youth in transition, with the focus on recognizing and supporting students with dyslexia, both diagnosed and undiagnosed. So there are students that happen to be really good at masking and also are really good grades-wise and are able to complete work, but that doesn't mean that they're not struggling. I myself, I was diagnosed with ADHD a year ago, but I had a really hard time with school. However, my parents were very, very strict with my grades, so I never had the ability or the chance to get diagnosed. So there are some of our students that we may not know are struggling and are definitely having a hard time. Our agenda, so we went ahead and started with the introduction. We're going to talk about understanding dyslexia, some misconceptions, and just kind of what, understanding dyslexia, some misconceptions, some information on how it affects students neurologically. And then we're going to talk about recognizing dyslexia in the classroom, what we can do as educators to help, and then dyslexia and universal design for learning, which then helps the rest of our classes, our classrooms. And then we'll go ahead and have a brief moment for a takeaway and any questions that you have. I hope I can answer, but if not, my goal is to be able to add a resource slide at the end of the presentation with links to resources that are based on your questions and your concerns on this topic. So it's going to be very much a catered to you resource guide. And because I understand that our attention span can be a little short sometimes, and we can't just sit here for 2 hours and listen to me go on and on and on, I am going to be building in breaks throughout the presentation. My goal is to do every 20 to 30 minutes, just because I know people require that reset and just being able to take a breather, because this is going to be a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions? You can feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. This is also, full disclosure, my first presentation ever, so I'm really excited to be here. And if there's any, I'm going to be posting a feedback link. So please don't hold back, let me know. All right, so introduction, my name is Sonya Rios. I've been in special education for 7 years. I got my liberal studies elementary education degree from Humboldt State in 2017. And then I went ahead and did the special ed credential program the following year for mild moderate. And then mid-pandemic, I decided it was the perfect time to get another credential. So I did that online and I got my single subject credential in math. Unfortunately, I guess I didn't get my credential, but I did the coursework. I haven't taken my CSETs, but I still have all that coursework done. And then in 3 weeks, I will be starting my master's program at Cal Poly Humboldt as well, for my master's in education. And I'm really excited about that. I have worked, excuse me, I've worked in Humboldt County, which is where I got my credential and did my student teaching. I worked in Monterey County in Soledad. I've also worked in Salinas. I've worked in private schools. So I kind of have moved around. And then I also worked in San Diego County in Escondido, where I worked at a middle school. I do primarily work with middle school students. That's been most of my experience. Because they're fantastic. And I think it's really fun to work with middle schoolers. So those are kind of my qualifications as to why I feel like I can do this. So moving on. So what is dyslexia? This is what you're here for. Does anybody have any experience working with dyslexia or have any, would anyone be willing to share what they think dyslexia is? You can go ahead and unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
Sonya, I'll tell you the stereotypical thing that comes to mind that I heard for decades is that people read things backwards with dyslexia. And that's about all I know about it.
Yeah, so a lot of people talk about how it's just flipping the letters. So sometimes it's about seeing letters and words backwards. I did see that someone wrote reading disability. So some common misconceptions about dyslexia is the first one. Dyslexia is about seeing letters and words backwards. That students with dyslexia are lazy and not trying hard enough, and that only reading is impacted and that it's rare. However, dyslexia affects 5 to 15% of the population. Students usually, it's one of the highest rated or highest diagnosed neurological disorders when it comes to learning disabilities. So it's more common than we think. Sorry, I have like my notes on the side. But yeah, so there's a lot, like I mentioned, a lot of misconceptions, and people always think that it's a visual disorder. So they think that it's that by changing the fonts or doing something different with the way people are writing, it's going to change their ability to read. However, dyslexia is a neurological disorder. It's a language-based learning disability that primarily affects reading, spelling, writing, and sometimes speaking. Dyslexia affects 20% of the population and represents 80 to 90% of all of those with learning disabilities. Students with dyslexia typically struggle with phonological awareness, so the sound structure of language, decoding, fluency, spelling, and word recognition. So it's basically associated with difficulty in processing the written form and the sound structure of language. Students with dyslexia are more likely to have a hard time reading a second language or learning a second language. And it had actually, studies do show that like when they've done brain scans, they show that students have a harder time learning a second language when they're dyslexic, which can then, if you start thinking about that rolling, like pebble, it's like they struggle with learning a second language, but that's also like a requirement to graduate. So they already have a few extra obstacles because of the dyslexia. So let's see. So if you look at the typical brain and dyslexic brain comparison, I hope you could see it at a good size. So there are different parts of our brain that are used while we're reading. So reading is not something that our brains were naturally wired to do, because it's something that it's a cultural invention that developed There isn't a single, like, there isn't a reading center in our brains. We utilize different parts of our brain that, so it's like understanding spoken language and recognizing objects. So two of the key processes in reading are decoding, so matching letters to sounds to sound out the words, and word recognition. So being able to look at a word and immediately knowing what that is and connecting them to the definition. These processes have more to do with like the left hemisphere of the brain, which I'm going to get into all of that sciencey stuff or more like specific. The occipital-temporal cortex is home of the visual word form area. So it's crucial to recognizing words from sight. So just like being able to like look at these slides and knowing that that says understanding dyslexia. What is dyslexia? Key facts and insights. We also use the temporal parietal and inferior frontal cortices, which are involved in sounding out words, which is the phonology, and understanding meaning, which is semantics, and speech production. So, like I said, we use a lot of that left side for decoding. And research shows that we can actually change the brain networks as children grow and develop, but it also functions differently in students with dyslexia. So usually research has shown that the left side dominance is important for language, and that for students or for people with dyslexia, that's missing. So there's also misplaced brain cells that were also noted, which also affects that. So it's a lot of brain stuff. And I know more people think, like I mentioned, that it's just flipping or that it's visual, but it does, there have been a lot of MRI studies that confirm that this is a neurological, and that does mean that it can be hereditary. So there is, that there are genetic variants to dyslexia. Yeah, so there have been changes in DSM terms. So trying to make sure I have this. So one thing is that we can, based on our reading instruction, change the way that the student or the person's brain works. So learning to read changes the brain in typical readers and people with dyslexia, but reading instruction can make a big difference. I will say one of the biggest things that I want to make sure I get across throughout this presentation is that not all cases are the same. You may, like, some things may work for some people, some things may not. This isn't a one size fits all type of approach, and that's not what I'm going to be presenting. It's really important to take into consideration what works for a student, and every student is going to be different, just like all of us are different. I've had students that benefit from certain fonts, but other students that would prefer to not use the same fonts. I've had students that love audiobooks and other students who are just like, nope, like that's not going to happen. So always make sure you check in with the student. They know themselves and they know what helps, and you might even help them figure out what it is that helps, which is also very important. It gives them kind of that autonomy to their learning. Before I move on to the next part, does anybody have any questions or anything they'd like to add?
Yeah, I have a question for you, Sonya. I'm going to be asking all the questions today, I think.
Yeah, no worries.
It is fascinating to me. When you step inside of a SPED classroom, as a substitute teacher, they're going to categorize it as, severe, mild, moderate. Do you have that type of situation with dyslexia where you have severe, mild, or moderate dyslexia, or is it just, as you mentioned, just various types of dyslexia?
I think it would be more as various types. It also depends on kind of like how the student was brought up, depending on the grade you're teaching. Like some students may have already been given the skills and the strategies to learn how to read and like how to work in a classroom. I don't know if saying in spite of their dyslexia is a good way to say it, but some students already have the skills and some don't. So some may struggle more, and I will be going over some of like the little things you can catch on to like see what, like if they're struggling and you could be like, wait a minute, like this, I don't know, like they're showing signs. And as I mentioned, not all cases are the same. It's not one size fits all. So you may see it with some students and not others. But there are there are some other common signs that you can see. And I will be going over those in a bit. But yeah, thank you for that question. We're going to be doing an activity, and I'm going to see if I can figure out how to do breakout rooms in this thing. But before I get there, I wanted to show you, or I'm going to show you the slide just because I really like what I put on there. So we're going to collaborate and listen. We're going to be talking about dyslexia. So I'm going to be putting or sharing a link. I did work really hard to find. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to find a simulation that kind of shows what it looks like to read something with dyslexia. However, as I mentioned earlier, everyone's different. So while I did find different types of simulations, a lot of them, I made sure they were vetted by different groups and was like, okay, so this one's not the right one, or, you know, like this one doesn't work. There was one that was very fascinating that I will share while you guys are in the break. I'll share it after we come back from the breakout rooms, where everything's moving and it looks really interesting and it looks very difficult to read. However, when I looked up the information on it and I kind of did the research to make sure it was accurate, there were people that said that it was less accurate than others. But like I mentioned, I will be showing you different examples. So in this activity, as you can see on the slide, when you see a Q, you're going to pronounce it as a D or a T. When you see a Z, you're going to pronounce it as an M. So make the M sound. When you see P, and this one's actually very common, even when students are learning language, when you see P, you're going to pronounce it as B. So and B, and vice versa. And then is or YS, you're going to pronounce as and A or A as in bat, you're going to pronounce as E as in pet, and vice versa. So like I mentioned, I'm going to put you in groups. I think it's going to be maybe like 4 to 5 people per group. I'll see how this works out. So with your breakout room, you're going to read the passage that I'm going to add using the translation key. The translation key will be on the link, so you're going to be able to go ahead and use that. It's not just going to disappear. I like to make sure you have access to all of that. So you can either choose to read it all individually and give yourself that time, or popcorn read. Before you click, so the way the website looks, let me go ahead and pull that up. Just want to make sure I have that. Okay, there you go. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what the website's going to look like. Can you see, wait. Can you see the tab I'm sharing? It looks very small. Okay, cool. Yeah. So basically this has the little chart I mentioned to you all, and I'll go ahead and zoom in. And what you're going to do is with your groups, you're going to follow that key, but you're going to go ahead and click begin. Go ahead, there we go, begin. And you're going to have this. So you're going to read the passage aloud or to yourself, whatever you prefer, and you're going to use that translation key. So just to use that first one, we begin our crib ek a familiar place. So you're going to do that with your peers, and then before, so like here it says finished, you're not going to click that quite yet. Go back here. Instead, you are going to be answering these questions, and I'll put them on the chat for you to use, make sure, which is how many cells are in the body, like yours and mine, and what is the main idea of the passage. And then once you talk about that, you can go ahead and click the finished and see if you got the right answers. And I'm going to give you about 15 minutes just because it is going to take a while because of the reading. Some of you may have an easier time, some of you may struggle more, but I want to have you experience that. So let me see. Does anybody have any questions before we break out into rooms? Okay. A question? Yes. Jennifer, do you have a question? Or are you good? Maybe I asked too many questions that you could say yes to. All right, I'm going to go ahead. Okay, cool. Let me set up the breakout rooms. Gosh, again, thank you so much for joining this call. Okay, I'm going to put breakout rooms of 5 people. Wait. There we go. And there is going to be, I'm going to put 15 minutes and then it's going to end the breakout room on its own. And like I said, I'll put the link in the chat. I'm hoping you'll still be able to get it, even though I put you in different rooms, but we will see. And there is going to be a few groups that are going to have like 1 or 2 extra people. And I'll be popping in here and there to see. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open that up. Let's hope it works. Okay. All right, so I'm going to be popping into different breakout rooms. All right, we're going to start seeing people pop up. Hello, welcome back. Seems like we're getting most of our people back. Perfect. All right, welcome back, everyone. So who is it? Does anybody have anything to share regarding that experience? I know reading that could have been a little tricky. And were any of you able to answer the questions, like how many cells are in a body? And what is the main idea? Did you feel like I gave you enough time, or would you frustrated trying to read? Like, does anybody want to share just kind of what happened and how you felt?
It was challenging for me. Like, so we talked in our group. It was, after 10 minutes, exactly, Miss Fano. Like, I wanted to stop reading too. You're like sitting there just trying to figure out the cues, going back and forth. And okay, now I've done 5, 6 words. Now let me put that together so I can understand it. Then you're on to the next word and you're just starting all over again. Just really challenging and frustrating.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Lawrence. I saw some people in the chat too that it took some time, that you wanted to stop reading, that it was very frustrating. Yes, Marie, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. So I just wanted to share that I heard you earlier say that you weren't sure about this session, if people were going to join. I feel like you should let everyone know that we should all join. It was until now that I actually felt what my students were feeling. I've never felt so anxious reading, and I could imagine myself being in a classroom, having to do a worksheet, having to turn it in, like maybe after class. Imagine what the student feels having to turn it in and getting graded and not knowing how to do it. It was the very first time I ever felt that.
Yeah,
So yes, share and do this session again. And I think all the teachers need to take this session.
Thank you. And I appreciate that. It is really interesting. One of the reasons I wanted to do this was primarily because, a lot of our lessons are timed, and we do that often as educators. We're like, you're going to have 20 minutes to do this. And then we just have them work on it, but we don't know how many students may be seeing things this way and maybe like, wait, what? And half the class is done and the other half doesn't even know what's going on. And this is kind of what I had you see the first time, and then this is what it was supposed to translate to. So I don't know how many of you actually had the opportunity to go and see the final product, or like the product that was given versus the product that was seen. But it's just really important to understand that not everyone's brain functions the same way. So there are times where we're going to struggle. And I do invite, like, I know because this is something that affects reading and writing, you assume, or some people may assume, not you in particularly, but you assume that this is only something that English teachers need to focus on. But if you think about scientific text, if you think about anything, a word problem in math, like these are all things that not only do they have to understand what they're reading, but then they have to utilize the skills for another type of class to solve that. So then it becomes like, I don't know how to read. I have this math question and I don't know what it's asking because it's taking me too long. Or in science, we have to read, especially in something like science where you're doing labs and you're following directions, like specific, like a set of directions. Yeah. And you're just like, wait, what do I do first? Or you get it. And then you're like, but what? Wait. So it's just kind of important to see what they see. Yes, Mr. Sanchez.
So I don't want to get ahead of you, but I
Mhm.
do have to ask, on the other end of the spectrum, is there something that people with dyslexia excel at? I mean, they just absolutely excel.
So one of the things that like they have a lot of strengths. So yes, they're going to have a hard time reading and it's going to take them a little longer, but usually they have to find different ways to figure things out. So they do have a lot of really good problem solving skills, a great imagination. Most students that have dyslexia have fantastic, like very curious, very imaginative. They have a good understanding of concepts, and they also, it's been shown that they're also a little more mature. And what I noticed that was really fascinating when I used to work at a school with a lot of students with dyslexia is that they have a really large vocabulary. So it's really interesting how they'll have a really large vocabulary, but then if you ask them to write it down, it's when they struggle, or to read it. But if they, like a lot of students use audiobooks or text to speech, so they'll be really good at like using these words and you're like, what? You're almost like taken aback because you're like, wait, how are you able to like, you know what the word means? Like I had a student once that really like he loved to do wordles in the morning, but he didn't know how to spell the words correct. Like he would do it based on sounds. So for example, like if you're looking at the word attention, instead of writing that like Tion at the end, he would do Shion. So then like in something like Wordle where you have a 5-letter limit to write down the answer, he would be like, well, it can't be this because it's 7 letters, but it wasn't 7 letters. It was just the way their brain was processing that word. So it's really interesting to kind of see, because they're also like their comprehension, like if they hear a story, they're able to thrive, and they understand like the big picture. And I'll get more into that in a little bit, but yeah, it's quite fascinating how even though they have a hard time with certain things, they like, I think that almost kind of helps them be more understanding and like learn more, especially when they know, because I think that's also very important. Um, but yeah, does anybody have anything else to share, or any like, how did it make you feel? How do you think your students feel in your classroom? I know we have a lot of different subjects and teachers that teach different grade levels, but I invite you to kind of reflect on like, what does it look like in a middle school classroom versus a high school classroom? Like what happens if you have students who maybe know they have dyslexia and are able to tell you versus students who may not know? And because it isn't one of those very visible type of learning disabilities, like how often do we assume that they're just, oh, they don't want to read it, or oh, they don't want to, or oh, they're being disruptive because they're just, it's just how they're misbehaving, but we don't know if they may be having a hard time reading and writing, because it translates into writing as well. So if anybody has anything to share or anything they want to say, you could say it in the, go ahead, Yvonne.
Do you know of some sort of a way to be able to kind of do some diagnosis if diagnosing is not available?
So I am going to share in a little bit. We're going to take a quick break, but afterwards I'm going to share some signs of dyslexia and kind of what they look like throughout the years, starting from like preschool to adults. So I'll be sharing that shortly, but yes, I will be doing that. Thank you for
Thank you.
asking. Anybody else? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and set, I think I'll give you until 11. I'm going to go ahead and it's break time. If you want to ask any other questions, I'll be on here. I kind of took a little break while you guys were in the breakout rooms after running around sharing the links. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to stay. You have until we'll resume again at 11. And then we'll go on to recognizing dyslexia in the classroom and what we can do for our students.
Sonya, you there?
Yes.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm happy to hear this subject. This is going on my 29th year, and I've taught kindergarten through seniors. Along that way, I've seen common reversals, upside down letters, up into second grade when I was teaching kindergarten in the elementary school. At what point would you say kids should grow out of it? I even saw some kids even in third grade still having reversals and what have you. So, and in those 29 years, I've never seen an IEP specifically call out dyslexia. I've seen, give student additional time for reading comprehension, provide audio books, what have you, but never specifically, hey, this child has dyslexia. So my question to you is, at what point do those reversals, should they go away, and at what point should we look at them as dyslexia? Definitely it's at the high school level. But then before we get into the SST process, what can we as teachers do to help them out in the meantime while that process plays out?
Yeah, so it's the thing with dyslexia is like we can do certain things at an early age while we're teaching reading and writing to kind of help those brain, like help kind of change the brain to help with that. However, it is something that they just kind of live with for life. So like I mentioned earlier, it would be a case-by-case basis. Like some students will never flip their letters, but they do still have dyslexia. And then there are some students who just, it's something that happens through high school and through college. Like I've worked with students that are in middle school and high school, and they flip their essays, or they flip upside down, like they flip certain letters upside down. But they're able to, like utilizing something like spell check or stuff like that, it kind of helps them out. So it's just a matter of giving them the skills and accommodations to help them with that, but there really isn't like a growing out of it. I think it just varies case by case. I don't know if that answered the first question.
I understand, each child is different and they bring with them their challenges. But having seen those little ones frustrated, that they see their kids, their buddies reading, and it's hard to explain to them, hey, you're different, you're seeing things differently. How then do I address it? And one thing you did mention is technology. I hadn't thought about that.
So speech to or text to speech is really helpful. And that's when we move into, which I'm going to talk about next, is just that universal design for learning. So being able to like, so that you don't like point out that kid and like call them out, just give all the students access to it. So let whoever wants to listen to the story and follow along, like do it that way. You can also do like full class readings, and that'll help. Because then you're not necessarily singling out that kid, but it helps the rest of the class too. Because if you have students that are struggling with vocabulary, or they get a little more nervous about reading out loud, you're helping them connect that word, those sounds of the words to the word while you're reading out loud and providing an example of the text. So they get to build that connection that like, they still may see, some of the stuff may still look different, but even just having that connection or being able to say like, oh, we read this story and maybe they didn't know what a word was, but if you define it and you say it, they can put that in their toolkit even though they can't spell it. So they'll be able to utilize vocabulary even though they're not necessarily spelling correctly. But that's when all the tech tools like autocorrect, Grammarly, and all that stuff can help.
So one last follow-up question to that then.
Mhm.
If we're helping out using technology, do you then cast aside or put aside phonemic awareness?
Not necessarily. So that's where it can get a little tricky. I know usually, and like one thing is, oh my gosh, what is it called? There are reading tools that we use, kind of like the Orton-Gillingham approach of reading, where we do more multisensory, so they're able to connect the sounds. So you don't really, it's like hard to answer. And you mentioned, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, so if we're relying on text-to-speech, audiobooks, what have you, do we put aside or diminish the importance of phonemic awareness?
I don't think so, because like I mentioned, usually you want to provide the visuals with the sounds. Like I usually like to use multisensory approach. So while they're listening, they're also looking at what they're listening to. And that kind of helps make that connection of the phonemes and the sounds to the words. Again, it varies kid to kid, but usually, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I'm so sorry.
It does, but just as a classroom teacher, English is visual, and then there's exceptions to the rule. It makes it even more difficult, because in Spanish, if I teach a P is a P, well, in English, a PH is an F. That doesn't happen. So I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I wish what I was looking for is hard and fast rule, but it doesn't seem like everything in life, it's a gray zone.
Yeah, and I will make sure to look a little more into that. And I can go ahead and send you an email with some resources and kind of more information on it. Because yeah, that dives a little deeper. Because as I was doing all of this, I also had a few questions myself where I was like, wait, like what about this and this? But I really do appreciate you asking those questions because it helps me see what else I should include in this and what else I should look into.
Can I add that when I've worked with Spanish-speaking students, that when they're learning to do English, when they're learning to read, I'm in middle school, we have some students that really need to have the rules where we have it so they can clearly see that an E makes this sound, and they want to know why. Why does it do that? And so then we have that so that they can see why it would do that, and we have examples. And then I think when you were asking about your first question, a lot of it, like B's and D's get mixed around. And so we give strategies of like, you know that these are your trouble letters. So you teach that, and then they're like, oh, wait, these are my trouble letters. So I think there's just strategies that you're constantly having to do. And it's just really time consuming.
Yeah.
Come on.
Thank you. Yeah. And sometimes that is it's going to take time. And as teachers, I mean, you all understand that's one of those things that we don't really get sometimes, but it is something that they need. We need to be very patient. We need to make sure to give them time. But it's kind of like we're working against the clock here, right? Because we have students, we need to have them at a certain level by a certain time. So then it's like, how do we help? And that's when like our resource specialists come in, and we're just kind of like, okay, how can we help? And we kind of work together to create plans and create, like kind of implement that IEP. But going back to like, what happens if they don't have an IEP yet? Or what happens if you're noticing that they're struggling, but they're getting by just enough so that we don't see any warning signs, and we're like, no, they don't need anything. We'll get right into that. So welcome everyone. We got a few extra minutes. I really appreciate the questions and the conversations that are happening. It's been really helpful, and I hope you're enjoying, or you're really like getting something out of this. It's something that I'm really passionate about, making sure that we're helping our students, especially those that struggle with learning disabilities. It's always been a big passion of mine. And I did see, Anne-Marie, that you asked what platforms our district has to use. Towards the end, I'll go ahead and go through the staff portal. I know there's some stuff there, and I'll make sure to kind of point them out and add it to that slide deck, or add it to that resource thing that I want to add to the slide deck at the end. But I will make sure I review that. So yeah, does anybody have any questions that before we jump back in? I know a few people already asked, but just in case. All right, so let me go ahead and restart this. All right, so recognizing dyslexia in the classroom. So this was really fun to put together, because as a special ed teacher, like some of us, we're tasked to kind of like see the signs, and even just as general ed teachers, we see some students and we're like, hey, like something seems kind of off. However, like one of the things that is kind of difficult in our field is that like I mentioned earlier, some students are just getting by, where they're getting those C's, those D's, and you're just kind of like we can't call for an IEP because they're not necessarily failing, but I see that they need help. So how do we help them? And that's what we're going to be talking about. Like, what can we use? What are the signs? And how do we help? So let me move on. One of the things is just how widespread it is. So I did add this kind of like fact sheet. About 13% of the school population nationwide are identified as having I don't like that it uses handicapping condition, but it qualifies as something that requires services. 1/2 of all the students who identify for special education are classified as having a learning disability. So I know, I believe it was Lorenzo earlier asked, like, why don't we see dyslexia specifically written on the IEP? And that's because it's not one of the 13 criteria we use, but it falls under a specific learning disability. So that's where it gets a little tricky, because then you really have to get into the IEP to get that information. And it's more like, I've been in meetings where I'm like, yeah, it looks like it's dyslexia. But it's not something that's necessarily written in that page where we talk about the, oh my God, the qualifying disabilities, for lack of a better word, sorry. But yeah, so 1/2 of all the students who are identified for special education are classified as having a learning disability. And about 85% of those students have a primary learning disability in reading and language processing. So sometimes you will see, you know, they have a specific learning disability with a reading processing disorder or a writing processing disorder. And that usually kind of hints to dyslexia, because that's the primary or the most commonly seen one. But yeah, you'll usually see it using the words like, oh, the student has a reading processing. Just like we say attention processing disorder. So that's more of like our ADHD kiddos. So there's different terms we use, which can be a little frustrating, because it's like, why don't we just say dyslexia? And then up to 15 to 20% of the population as a whole may have symptoms of dyslexia, including slow or inaccurate reading, weak spelling, and poor writing. And not all will qualify, which is what I mentioned. Not all will qualify for special education, but most benefit from systemic and explicit instruction in reading, writing, and language, which is that structured literacy. That's what I was looking for earlier. Structured literacy is an Orton-Gillingham approach that is used in different places. It kind of varies. Sometimes we specifically use it for special education students, but it's an approach where you use that multisensory, you know, they'll write on the air, they'll tap the sounds, which is something that we used to do a lot. So it would be like dyslexia, and that helps them kind of see. I think that's where the phonemic awareness comes in, but it's just that tapping that helps them know the sounds to the words. And then, yeah, so these are just kind of a few facts about how we see dyslexia in the classroom. Does anybody have any questions about that? All right. So recognizing dyslexia in the classroom, and there's way more than this. This was just kind of like the early grades versus upper grades. And I did find more information on this after I created the slides that I wanted to add, but I'm gonna add that to the resource page because it's a whole, it's a lot of information. So usually when we're looking at that early age from kindergarten to 2nd grade, you're gonna see that some of the students have trouble with rhyming or learning letter sounds. They might have trouble learning common nursery rhymes, difficulty learning and remembering letters of the alphabet, can't recognize letters in their own names. So you'll see it very early on, or like they'll mispronounce familiar words or use more of that like quote unquote baby talk. And then they'll confuse those similar letters. And like one of those things kind of like was brought up with the trouble letters. It's just like, I know there's bed where you kind of see the B. Obviously it looks a little different because of the camera, but you know, you write the word bed and you know the beginning, which is the B sound, is going to face one way, and then the D is going to face the other way, which is the last sound of that word. So usually like the word bed is a very helpful way to teach the BD sounds. And then sometimes we'll see speech delays or word finding issues. And sometimes it's a family history of reading or spelling difficulties, because it is something that can run in the family. More difficulties, not understanding how words come apart, complaining about how hard reading is and that things may disappear, or like they may start. So one big thing is like avoidance. And that's going to happen. And I'm sure we've all seen it in the classroom, whether it's reading, writing, math, any subject. When the student, or when a person in general is not good at something, they're not going to want to do it. So you'll see that, like, if we're going to have a reading activity in class, all of a sudden the student gets a stomach ache, needs to use the restroom, needs to go out for a walk, or just doesn't want to do it. Sometimes that's more of a plea for help, or like they don't want to do it because they don't know how, but they don't know how to express that. So sometimes, and like I mentioned, we see it in the classroom for everything. It's not necessarily just for dyslexia and reading. Sometimes if they don't know their multiplication and we have a lot of multiplication problems, all of a sudden it's like, I need to use the restroom, and then they're gone for 10 minutes. There's also, like I mentioned, even though there are those difficulties, there are still a lot of strengths. A lot of students tend to have that imagination. They're able to figure things out differently. They're very resilient a lot of the time. And I know we talked about how like sometimes they may not know and some students do know, and it's just kind of up to the parents' discretion, or that's a whole other topic that we're not going to get into. But, I personally think it's really important for students to know what's going on with them that kind of hinders their ability to learn like everyone else. So I personally think it's really important to let students know, like, hey, you are struggling with dyslexia, and here's what that means, and here's what we can do to help you. Because then it kind of helps them give a name to their struggles. And that way they're able to work on it, and not just blame themselves for not being able to do something, because then that's a whole mental health approach that happens, and we can go down that rabbit hole, just that domino effect that happens when they're not able to understand what's going on. When students hit second grade through high school, you'll notice that they may have trouble with reading fluency and comprehension. So you might give them something to read and it takes them really long, or they're able to read it, but they don't know what they read, which is very common. Their reading can be slow and awkward. So they can, be like, trouble with reading fluency. And so it's going to be very awkward reading, especially at a time where most of the peers, like average peers, are reading faster. You'll be able to notice it a little more. They'll try to avoid reading out loud because, again, it's putting them on the spot. They may not know. So in this situation, something that would be helpful is to give them the reading ahead of time, or let them listen to it before they're going to read it, just so that they have that beforehand if it's imperative that they read out loud in your class. Poor spelling and writing structure, you'll see a lot, and I'll show an example of like the words written with the letters upside down, backwards. But then you'll also kind of see how they're writing words the way they sound. Yes, Lorenzo.
Sonia, earlier you mentioned, or rather you gave us a chart with some common letters, combinations of what we see and what students see.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that fluid, or once I say, hey, Sonia sees a T as a P, is that going to be constant, or is that going to be fluid depending on stressors, depending on, fluidity? Or somebody else mentioned that they see them as moving.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess once I know a student and I'm trying to help him with a couple, maybe he's got mild dyslexia and he's only got 3 or 4 letters that he's seeing as differently. So I can go back to what somebody mentioned earlier and say, oh, this is your problem letter.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, like there's going to be how with some of the students, when you start what's the right word? Intervention strategies early on, they will be able to kind of like learn like, oh, this is like Ms. Stefan said, like, this is a trouble letter and this is what I struggle with. But I think after repetition, because repetition really, really helps, they may be able to kind of like, I guess, for lack of better terms, like move on or move up. But yeah, the thing about dyslexia and kind of like the visuals, like, and I mentioned that when I was talking about the example that I provided you all to kind of read, that's just one way. So like when I was looking for different like simulations of what it looks like, there's some where the letters are kind of like wavy. There's some when the letters like change. And actually, let me see if I can find that simulation. But yeah, I was looking at different things and I was like, oh, this is interesting because like, here's another example that was shared. I'm not sure if you can see it, but this is another example of what it can look like. Not necessarily what it looks like for everyone, but what it can look like. And as you can see, that's very different from the other thing we read. Yeah, I don't know if that's kind of helpful to the question you asked.
Definitely, it's cleared up for me.
Yeah, because this one, like, I thought this one was very fascinating, but I also read a lot of stuff about how this can be a little, like, I actually think I have yeah, it can be a little confusing for people when they see it that way, because then they just assume that's the only way. So while simulations are trying to provide like a positive look at dyslexia, or not a positive look, but kind of like trying to help other people understand, it can also be misleading. But let me go ahead and go back to this. There we go. So as we move on, and I'll share this link, the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity has basically signs of dyslexia from kindergarten to the adult life. And it also writes on there, you know, kind of like strengths. But as our students and people reach that more like an adult, you'll start seeing how it affects not just their reading. So in terms of speaking, instead of naming objects, they might be that thing, the stuff, you know, kind of more of like a general term for something instead of saying like my phone or my notebook. They'll also pause and hesitate a lot when they're speaking, and they'll confuse words that sound alike. And again, not everyone, but it can happen. So they might say tornado instead of volcano, or they might say lotion instead of ocean because they sound very similar. There is going to be that mispronunciation of long, unfamiliar, complicated words, and then they might need that additional time to answer questions because they also, that processing aspect of it. Once we move into more of like overall school and life, they may have a hard time remembering dates. Names is a big one, telephone numbers, random lists, that timing, they're going to struggle to finish things on time. And I know like we do a lot of things that are like, this is how much time you have, but this is why the IEP and following accommodations is so important, because there's a reason they have that accommodation. Like you noticed with that reading that I had you do earlier, you needed more time because as you were reading, you were getting more frustrated. So you needed, like, it was needed, you know, just that extra time. There's also like extreme difficulty in learning a foreign language. So thinking about emerging bilinguals, students in high school taking an extra language course because it's a requirement, they may struggle a little bit more. So it's also something to consider when working specifically with a student who has an IEP, because, oh gosh, where was I going with this? It just like slipped. But yeah, emerging bilinguals taking foreign languages. One thing that I've noticed, and I don't know if that's the case here, because like I mentioned, I started working in April, but one big thing I've noticed is that sometimes IEPs are only focused on by core teachers, And we don't acknowledge that, like, or we kind of don't think about the fact that when students go into other classes, their learning disability doesn't just go away. So just because it's not a math class or it's not an English class doesn't mean that we shouldn't, like, I mean, legally we have to follow the IEP, but it does, like, we still have to consider that they're having struggles in other classes that are not the core classes, which I think is something that's really important for people to think about. And it's not often talked about enough, in my opinion. Yes.
So you mentioned math class, so it will affect their ability to decipher digits, numerals.
So that's more dyscalculia, and that's a different thing. Like, I had a student who would make all their 9s 6s, or like all their 6s were backwards. But that's like a different, but it does affect their math as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity has a lot of just kind of like data and research on that, and just like, what do we do with math? Because like I mentioned before, we do have those math problems that come up. And let me see if I can find that part of it, because there is like a whole math approach, which I should have added more of that on here. But I will be sharing that in the list of stuff that I share at the end, because it does affect math, and it affects their ability even to like look at graphs. Gosh, why can I not find it right now? I will look for that and I will get back to you. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, it does affect multiple subjects. And as I mentioned earlier, oh, I think I found it. There we go. So one of the big things that we talked about with dyslexia is that it also affects their writing, right? So if you look at trying to solve, for example, like a multi-step equation, right? You have to be able to have very clear writing, and like sometimes we'll use a graph paper so that they have a square for each part of the equation. So then, you know, having to have that neat writing in order to be able to solve something or do multiple steps can affect their class. Like, I don't know if I'm making sense, but on top of that, you know, the time, word problems, like Adrienne mentioned, you know, having to read through that and then answer a question. Sometimes, like, if you give them a word problem, like some students can just identify all the aspects and all that, but then if they need extra time just to read the problem, and then they still have to add, which I brought up earlier, you know, having those multiple steps that you have to follow to get to the answer of a problem, like, it's really hard. But yeah, I will share, I did find all the information on the math struggles, so I will make sure to share that. But it talks about like processing breakdowns, naming problems, and just kind of how dyslexia can affect math class, and it's more specific to that. And then yeah, algebra, switching positive and negative signs, or missing out on those steps. Or even if you do provide, which is, see, like, this is where it gets really tricky, because if you do provide the step-by-step examples and it's in like words, you know, like first you isolate the variable. If they can't read that step, then they don't know, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't translate as well. So it's just, it's an ongoing kind of, we just find more and more. I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope it did. Okay. My ADHD sometimes makes me ramble, and I just like, I go into my little like rants or vents, and I'm just like, wait, did I do the thing? So I appreciate your patience. So then let me go ahead. So here's an example of writing. A 10-year-old with dyslexia, this specifically focuses on reversing his B's and D's. So what this says, so that little section, The glow-in-the-dark shark lives deep in the ocean. The whale shark has a lot of teeth. All sharks are made of cartilage. So when we analyze these, you see how he wrote glow, and it's GLO. So it's similar. Like you could see that he kind of has the sounds are there, like they're able to, because if you look at, what is it? The glow in the dark. So the dark, it's bark, lives deep in the ocean. So even ocean. So just focusing on that one, it's OSHN. If you put those sounds together, ocean, ocean. So it's not that far off, it's just the spelling. So it's that connection of being like, oh, well, like here we're using a C and an EA as opposed to that sh sound. But you hear that sh sound when you say the word. So they do make those connections. So their spelling is always going to be a little more literal, I guess is the better way of saying that. So if you see the whale, WALE, whale, like the sounds are there, has a lot of teeth. Of is UF, teeth is TEEF, teeth. So it may be a little harder. And one of the things that we do recommend is that when you aren't doing a spelling specific assignment, don't dock points for that. You know, like if you can understand more or less what they're writing, like I feel like they're getting their point across. They're trying to let you know that they understand the material. They might just not be able to spell it correctly. And it's hard because, you know, you want to say like, well, you misspelled ocean, but you're still understanding. I don't know if that's like, everyone has their own opinion about that. But that's something that I think is really important. Like, let's not dock students for being able to get their point across if it's not focused on spelling. Now with English class, it might be a little different, but that's just something that I think is important to keep in mind. But yeah, so how can we help? This is basically the most important part of this presentation. How can we help our students, diagnosed and undiagnosed? So this is a very tight slide, and so there are 3 different things we can do. There's instructional supports, so being sure we're being explicit and multisensory with our instruction in phonics. Using visuals, manipulatives, and movement when teaching reading and writing. So, excuse me, that can look different. I know there are videos where people turn like lessons into songs and stuff like that. Music is another thing that really, really helps students in general, not just for dyslexia, but those are other things. Pre-teaching vocabulary and providing access to audiobooks or text-to-speech tools. This one's really important, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the different text-to-speech stuff that we have in our computers, all the attachments that we can add to, all the add-ons we can put on Chrome. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that. And one of the biggest things, and I believe it's also on here, yeah, under environmental and emotional support, we have to destigmatize the use of these things. The amount of times I've worked with students, or I'm having a one-on-one conversation, and I'm like, why don't you use your text-to-speech or your speech-to-text? Like, you have the tools, you know how to use them. Well, I'm embarrassed, or I don't have headphones, or I don't want my classmates to think I'm weird, or like, I don't need help. There's also that big one, like, I don't need the help. But it's really important to destigmatize, and that's when we'll move on to the universal design for learning. But those are other things that can help. Classroom accommodations, we have our usual set. We also, some students come with more specific accommodations with their IEPs, but just allowing extra time on tests and reading assignments, not penalizing for spelling or non-spelling assignments, giving students the option. So this one can be a little problematic because you can have some students write an essay, and sometimes they have to learn the composition of an essay. You know, you want to make sure they know how to write. But if the student can answer the question verbally, orally, instead of writing it down, give them that option, because you'd be surprised at how much they know that they can't write down. So giving the students the option to offer an oral response instead of writing one can be really helpful for them to show you what they know. And then providing copies of notes or guided notes, and then allowing the use of assistive technology. This includes in word processors. I've seen some teachers do this, which is really cool. You know, if you're having them write an essay, you change the color of each essay based on what they have to write and give them kind of tools on how to do that. Graphic organizers are always really helpful, but that speech to text is going to be crucial because, as I mentioned before, students with dyslexia can have really high vocabularies, but they just don't know how to write the words correctly. So being able to use that speech to text and then the grammar tools or like spell check is going to be extremely helpful for their writing. And then again, creating a safe, stigma-free space for reading aloud and using these tools is going to make a huge difference. Encouraging effort over correctness to build confidence, and just that frequent check-in. Especially with our students who are undiagnosed or just don't know. I think it's really important to be like, hey, how are you doing? Do you understand this? And sometimes even just pairing them with a student who maybe is a stronger reader and that can read the stuff for them or to them, not for them, to them, so they can work together. That's also a really big thing. Use your students, use the strengths you have in your classroom. That's really important. Don't try to invent new things. Like, there are so many strategies, and I can share more. If you're interested, I'll share my contact info. Reach out to your resource specialists, which, you know, we can all work together and figure it out. But there's so much we can do. And I think I'm really excited that you're all here to listen to this. And I hope it's helpful, because I think even making really small tweaks to our classes and like our lessons can make a big difference for some of our students, excuse me. Does anybody have any questions about support or strategies? Like I said, it's not one size fits all. So sometimes we are going to have to get a little creative with some things.
Is dyslexia commonly misdiagnosed?
I didn't see much about that. So it doesn't seem like that one's misdiagnosed too often. I personally, and I'm going to go ahead and add that on there, like, I think a lot of students are misdiagnosed due to behavior, because you assume, and like, it goes back to, you know, students who behave a certain way trying to communicate that they don't understand something. But right now, testing for dyslexia is still kind of up and coming. It's not like we can just brain scan all of our students to figure it out. So there are still assessments that are being worked on. I know as a resource specialist, the assessments we give, there are sections that focus more on that dyslexia, so we can kind of see more or less how they are. I would encourage asking that during an IEP, like, what are we seeing about dyslexia? Is it like, are we seeing that it's possible? Are we seeing that it's there? But yeah, I haven't seen too many cases where it's misdiagnosed, but I think it's, you know, just like everything, there's always like one or two outliers in that situation. So UDL, Universal Design for Learning. This is one of the most popular buzzwords in education. Universal Design for Learning is an educational framework that benefits all learners by offering multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. So what does that look like? An example, a student with dyslexia can listen to a story on audio, which is the representation, of the text in audio form, discuss it with a partner, which is an expression and engagement, or expression, sorry, action and expression, and then create a comic strip summary, which is the engagement. So rather than having all your students write an essay to explain what the story was about or what they learned, have them draw things out, have them give oral presentations, have them create presentations like slide decks where they're putting pictures up and they're like, give students the opportunity to showcase their knowledge in different ways. That's crucial with our students because not everyone, like even with this presentation, I can tell you right now that there is so much I have to fix because I've been talking so much and not everyone processes like listening as well as others. So some of you may have checked out a while back. Some of you may have needed visuals this whole time. Some of you may have needed more videos. And if we were in person, we might have moved around a little more so that we could really like grasp the information. And even this isn't the best example of a universal designed presentation. But even doing little things, just like having this closed caption stuff, you know, you can read it if maybe I'm speaking too fast, or having people being able to like restate what I mentioned, or summarize what you've been talking about. So those are different things that if you go to a lot of dyslexia specific websites, it's really interesting because they'll have the tools on the side. So for example, back to the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, they have audio versions of the page for you to listen to. And they actually have like different things you can use to access the website. So yeah, and I know it was sent earlier, but color coding can also really help. So let me see. So takeaways in Q&A. I hope this helped. I hope you were able to get some new information. And if maybe this isn't new to you, I hope it just, you know, kind of reminded you of the importance of taking into consideration some of the the way different students learn, and just even being able to have that experience with the reading, I think was really important. But as I mentioned earlier, the objective for today was to equip you all with strategies to design more inclusive lessons and integrating support tools. I really hope this was helpful. And this is, if you have any questions, go ahead and you can put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself. All right. I ended a little earlier than I expected, but this was Decoding Dyslexia, Strategies that Support Every Learner. There is an evaluation form. I'm going to go ahead and add that to the chat real quick. If I can figure out how to get there. And then if you have any questions, you can contact me, Sonya Rios, sonya.rios at Salinas Union High School, SalinasUnionHSD.org. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Okay, so in layman's terms, when you're trying to figure out what's going on with a student, you're going to look for a Q turned around into a P transposed. You're going to look for a D becoming a B and things like that, right?
And even just writing, if you see that they're writing more based on sounds than they are based like using the writing rules, so to speak, for like that example of ocean, OSHN, that's also going to help. But yeah, pretty much you'll see more commonly you'll see that, but yeah. And then yes, the resource page, I'm going to add that based on what we've kind of talked about. A big one that I'm going to share is I personally love the layout of the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. They kind of talk about what it is, early clues, and then it talks about, it has resources for educators and tools and technology. So I'll send that. and it talks about math, which I think is really important. And I'll also put together some other things, including the link where I had you that I used for you guys to practice. Thank you so much. Please take the time to complete the evaluation form. I would love to find new ways to make this more accessible, make it more like, just make it better for everyone. I appreciate all of you showing up. And yeah, thank you. If you have any questions, I'm gonna stick around for a bit. I know we still have like 15 minutes, but yeah, you're all good. It was really good to present to you all. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording.
Great presentation, Sonia. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.